Hey Islanders, and welcome to episode 25 of the Camano Voice. On this episode, I speak to the Chief of Camano Island Fire and Rescue. Please welcome Levon Yongoyan. Hi, I'm Brandon Erickson, and you're listening to the Camano Voice podcast, where I interview folks around Camano Island and beyond. If you want to stay up to date on events, businesses, and even hear a little history of this area, subscribe to this podcast and share with your friends. Thanks for listening. Hey Islanders, and welcome to another episode of the Camano Voice, where we release a new episode every Tuesday. Hope you guys all had a great Christmas. I think I had a good Christmas. Hey, this is actually being recorded prior to Christmas, so it's kind of tricky, huh? It's weird talking to you in the future and the past at the same time. Anyways, back to the actual story of what I'm trying to talk about. This podcast, I got to speak with Levon Yongoyan. I'm going to get that wrong multiple times. And we get to talk about his history in small business before becoming the fire chief of Burlington Fire Department, and then later on, currently, the fire chief of Camano Island Fire and Rescue. So it's a great conversation. We get to talk about how did he bring in the lessons from being a small business owner and the managing a team, leading, transitioning into a leadership role with the Burlington Fire Department, and then the biggest differences and challenges between being in a single station Burlington Fire Department versus moving to Camano Island, where there's multiple fire stations. And so we get into all of that in our conversation. So without further ado, please enjoy my conversation with Levon Yongoyan. Hey Islanders, and welcome to another episode of the Camano Voice. Today I'm here with Levon Yongoyan, the fire chief of the Camano Island Fire. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Brad. I'm happy to be here.
So before we get started, tell us a little about Levon.
I don't know what to say. I don't really like talking about myself, but I grew up in Michigan, in Ann Arbor. My dad was a professor there. He was an anthropologist. So as a young age, we traveled all over the world. We lived in Australia. My mom's Filipino, spent a lot of time in the Philippines. I think I went to 5 different schools during grade school alone. But ended up coming out west and just fell in love with the Pacific Northwest and moved to Kamino in '98 and just love being here. It's an incredible community to be part of.
Very cool. So what was that like growing up in so many different cultures and areas? And
yeah, a lot of it, I was so young, I don't remember a lot of it, but I know that it's impacted me. I certainly have a lot of I like to think I have some perspective for the rest of the world. In fact, for the last couple of years, my wife and I have been trying to do a lot of traveling with our son, who's now, he just turned 17. Okay. But it's such a formative age to travel, right? And see that the rest of the world doesn't live the way we do. So right. I think that just kind of imparted me from a young age the importance of seeing how other people in this world live.
Right. And I think this, we're at a special time in life, not just life, but in this, timeline. But basically that travel is so much more affordable and easier to do than it has ever been in the past.
Yeah, it really is. And it's amazing how in some ways, the world seems to get really small because it is to travel. Mm-hmm. Yet when you get out there, you realize, gosh, it's so different in different places that it's really quite vast.
Right. And not only that, but the difference people live, we in America or even in the Northwest, you get in these microcosms of how people live, and you think this is how people live.
Yeah.
And when you go and travel, you see how people live in a completely different way, and yet it's exactly what they've always, it's how they've lived, and they're perfectly happy living the way they do.
Yeah. We traveled to Vietnam a couple of years ago, and we were up in the Mong region in northern Vietnam with people that subsistence farm in some incredibly tough conditions. And I guess just really naive on my part, but it was amazing to me to see that while they lived in conditions that we would consider quite difficult to live in, small houses, everybody crammed into one room, they all had smartphones. They were all on Google. They all watched YouTube. They're all on Facebook. So again, very different from how we live, but yet very connected in a different way.
Right. Yeah. That's for sure something that the internet has brought around. That's just the communication around the world is just incredible.
Yeah, and the fact that we can stay in touch with some of those people, it's phenomenal.
Yeah. No, that's very cool. So you said you moved to Camano in '98. What brought you to Camano Island?
I used to have a small consulting firm, and my wife and I, we had a couple of business partners, and we were all living in Seattle. And we all just wanted to move out of the city. We just wanted to be somewhere a little bit more rural, a little bit more connected with community. And we looked up in North Bend, we looked over in Eastern Washington, and they did a trip up here. And they called us and said, "We love Camano Island. We are moving there. You are happy to move here. We'd love it. We can relocate our business here, or if you want to go wherever else, we'll be happy to commute, but we need to be on Kamino." And so my wife and I came up one day and I think just kind of fell in love with it that very day. I'll never forget driving down the hill from Hagen's into town. It was a beautiful sunny day, and just seeing the water, seeing the islands, seeing the mountains. We were hooked from day one.
Yeah, very cool. Yeah, then I've said it so many times on this podcast, but that's so many people's story of how they discovered and moved to Kamino. Is immediately driving on, they're like, "Oh, this is where I'm gonna set down roots."
Yeah, and yet you talk to so many people and they say, "What? Where?" Like it's so
Right.
unheard of in a lot of ways. I think we're all very fortunate to be here.
Yeah, for sure. So actually, I want to touch on that. So you said you had a consulting firm. Then what was the name of that, and what was its focus?
Yeah, so I ended up going to grad school at University of Washington, and when I was doing my graduate study, I ended up getting involved in geographic information systems, GIS, which is essentially, people think of it as mapping, but it's much more. It's spatial analysis of information and data visualization. And at that time, GIS was really new. Of course, we see it everywhere today. But I kind of found a niche, and so a partner that I met in grad school, he and I started a company. It was called Terralogic GIS, and we ran that here in town. We were in the Granary building for many, many years in Stanwood upstairs.
Cool.
Yeah, and we ended up, we had maybe 5, 6 employees, kind of just small business. We had a lot of fun doing that.
Yeah. So, so the geographic information. Do you mean geological side, or
no?
Okay.
Really, it's geographic in the sense that anything that has a spatial component, which when you start to think of it, is really almost everything. I'll never forget at one point, we were doing a project. We were working on mapping all the groundfish habitat on the entire West Coast with National Marine Fisheries Service. And at the same time, I was talking to somebody who wanted to map nerve centers in monkey brains. Again, they both have a spatial component at a very different scale. And it was one of the things I just kind of fell in love with that industry, was how do you apply this, again, at the time was very new way of looking at data and doing statistical analysis on problems that we never thought you could apply it to in the past.
Wow, that's very cool. And what was your degree again?
My master's is in wildlife biology, wildlife science.
Okay.
Yeah.
So was your plan to continue on in that path of wildlife and?
When I got out of school, yes, it was. I worked for a consulting firm in Seattle as a biologist for a bit, but I think the GIS piece really kind of struck me. And then, oddly enough, I kind of just fell in love with being a small business owner. I really liked running an organization, having employees. That was a part that I never really thought I would gravitate to, but I just ended up loving it.
Yeah, that's neat. So, so then you were how many years were you doing that then?
Oh boy, I think we had that company for about maybe 7 or 8 years, and then we sold it, and then continued to work for the company that bought us for another few years after that.
Okay, so you were doing that, and then how did you transition from that into, or did you transition from that into fire department, or did you go somewhere else first?
I spent a few years working with a local land developer company. They were based out of Arlington, and it was, again, before the crash, so development was really big, but our concept there was to really try and create more community neighborhoods. Don't know if you're familiar with new urbanism, but it was really that concept of our neighborhoods should be places where people connect, not just drive into your garage because that's at the front of the house and you go in and you don't never see your neighbors. So how do you create walkable communities with places to go and gather, really get people out of their homes, out of their garages, out of their driveways, and create community feel. So I worked with them for a few years, and of course, 2008 hit, and then just was time to make a change into something else.
Yeah. So then, did you guys complete some of these neighborhoods then?
Smaller ones we did in the Arlington area. We were working on a very large one in Arlington that, unfortunately, when the timing, it never materialized. But It was unfortunate. We traveled around to look at some new urbanism developments in various parts of the country, and was really fascinated by that concept. How do you bring people together?
Right. Well, and kind of connects back to our earlier part of this conversation, but just that despite the fact that we have instant communication at our fingertips at all times, the community aspect really has suffered from that to some degree.
It's interesting. Again, as I said, I have a 17-year-old son, and I think about it, or we talk about it a lot. What is connection? He connects with people via his phone, I want him to go play with his friends, and he does. We were out at a fire department event one day, and a friend of his came along. And at the end of the day, we were driving back home, and John says to his friend, "Do you want to hang out?" And his friend says, "Yeah." And John says, "Okay, well, when I get home, I'll call you." And I was just like, well, doesn't hanging out mean like you're physically together? But it doesn't. So I guess it's part of us getting older and having to see that, things change.
Yeah. Well, and on the other hand of that too, like growing up, obviously I didn't have a cell phone, but my friend and I, one of us, or both of us were really good friends, and we would go and like do a whole day trip together. Like we would go out to like Friday Harbor. His grandparents would take us there, and we'd be on the ferry together, be hanging out. Then ferry back, get home. They would drop me off at my home, and as soon as they dropped me off, I'd be like, "Hey, give me a call when you get home."
Yeah.
And then we would talk for the next few hours, which of course was an issue because back then your phone line was also your internet line, and you only had one line. So then my parents would eventually kick us off. But that was, yeah, I mean,
and you had that balance of both, though, right? That
Yeah.
balance of together, and it's interesting. I hate to sound like an old fuddy-duddy, but it's interesting watching my son and trying to understand how he connects and he relates versus what we grew up with, and not always saying, well, you should do it our way, but say, this is how it's done these days.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
That made me sound really old.
That's all right. Okay, so then you were doing that, and then actually I want to follow that question up a little bit with, is that something you still kind of look into to see what developing, that's the word, developing neighborhoods, if they're building more of that type of model?
No, not really. Okay. I think it's interesting how developments go. My wife and I love to go walk neighborhoods. We've always liked to do that and kind of look at architecture and think about neighborhoods and that type of thing. So we do that just kind of just because it's something that we've always enjoyed. My wife grew up in Michigan as well. Oddly enough, we met in Seattle, but she grew up about 20 minutes from me. And it was different back in the Midwest. I think the town's very different than Western Washington, a lot older towns, different types of neighborhoods. So, we love walking around and kind of seeing how things develop, how homes are built, and what they kind of do for that neighborhood feel.
Yeah, no, and I experienced that a little bit in Charleston. There's different, things are just laid out different in how they do things. And one of the things that we came across that we noticed over in Charleston versus like Seattle is you get these neighborhoods that are like architecturally very well designed, like just very aesthetically pleasing and neat, like how they put it together and how it was all put together. It seems like it was put together as a vision of like the entirety, not just like one house was like, well, I'm going to do this and I'm going to do this.
Yeah.
And so we're looking around like, man, the architecture over here is really neat. And you go to, a lot of places in Washington, you look at the architecture, it's not that complex, and it's not really, I don't know, it's not like it's all designed as one always. And but one of the things we notice is like, but when you're in Charleston, like your surrounding isn't like it's flat. It is like when you go up on a bridge that goes up above sea level a little ways, like you can see as far as your eye can see, like, and there's nothing. And there's not a whole lot of natural beauty. I mean, there's the ocean, but like there's nothing on your other side, and it's just flat and kind of, I don't know, nothing there. Versus you come back here and like no one's looking at the buildings. They're looking at the mountains and the rivers and the ocean and like everything over here. So our conclusion was that we've got so much natural beauty that we're just like, whatever with architecture.
Well, I think it's interesting to see how things take shape over time. Right?
Yeah.
It's like a lot of our stuff is built all at once, where cities like Charleston's evolved over so much time, and now they re-evolve. We were in Portugal last year, and again, talk about old, right? Talk about evolving over time and seeing how the impacts in Lisbon of the earthquake that happened and the flood that happened and the fire that happened, how it reshaped these neighborhoods to what they are today. It was really wonderful to see.
Yeah. Very cool. So then you moved from building neighborhoods and stuff. The crash happened. What happened next?
I've been with the fire department since we moved up in 1998. I think we moved here in August, and I joined the fire department in September. So kind of right from the get-go. So I've been a volunteer here for many years. And so in 2008, I was just kind of looking for a different change. I'd done some work with our GIS firm with a bunch of different fire departments in the area, and it was kind of a fun way to combine two interests of mine, both the fire service as well as the GIS.
Yeah.
But in 2008, there was just an opportunity to come here and do some work for the fire department full time, and just kind of things worked out kind of just perfectly at that time for me to come to work for the fire department as a full-time employee.
Right. And so when was the actual transition from the volunteer fire department to the actual established one?
So again, I started in 1998. In January of 1999, we hired our first 3 career firefighters.
Okay.
And so, 20 years ago, it's hard to believe that it's been that long. And in fact, in September, we had one of those 3 individuals that retired after, 20 years serving as a full-time firefighter. We had also volunteered with our organization for 7 or 8 years before that. So
very cool.
1999 was first 3 on days, and then it's kind of just evolved through the years to what it is today.
Okay, so then you started in 2008 as a full-time.
Correct.
And what happened next then?
Served here from 2008 until 2016, and just had the pleasure of working with all the wonderful people here and under the fire chief at the time. And then in 2016, the opportunity came up in Burlington. They were looking for a fire chief, and I was the assistant chief here at the time. And it just seemed like a great opportunity to kind of spread my wings, get some different experience, work in a different type of system, take on that role of fire chief, which is very different than being the assistant chief. And so I was up there for almost 3 years until I got invited to come back.
Okay, so then what was some of the biggest differences you noticed in working in a smaller fire department versus Burlington?
Well, actually, Burlington at the time was a smaller fire department than Camano. Burlington, because we think of Burlington as that big area, but really the city of Burlington is 4.5 square miles.
Oh, really? Okay.
So it's much smaller, served out of just one station. So a lot of differences in the type of service that's provided there. 4.5 square miles, Burlington, right? Costco, Best Buy, a very, very large commercial industrial core. Still some great kind of neighborhoods in the old part of the city. But versus Camano, 45 square miles, primarily residential, very little commercial. So it was a very different type of service there. Also different working for a city versus working for a fire district. That presents a lot of differences in how we operate, what the responsibility is. But besides the differences, the things that are the same, which is incredible people. This department here is so full of great, passionate, compassionate people that really, truly believe in service. And Burlington was the same way. I can't say enough about the people in that organization.
Yeah. Well, what are some of the differences in the, operating in a city versus rural?
Yeah, a lot of operational differences just in terms of, operating a ladder truck and providing a section of highway that goes through. So a lot of those types of things that we don't have here. Also interesting, one of the reasons I love Kamino, it's very unique. And from a fire perspective, it's very unique in how we have to serve here. Burlington, I'm surrounded by Mount Vernon to the south of us, districts that are around us. There's help coming from all these different areas when we have that large call or we have multiple calls going on at the same time. We don't have that on the island, right? We have one point of access, as everybody knows, and it's at the very, very northeast corner of the island. So when we need help, it can only come from one place. And so it just creates for some different dynamics in terms of how do we prepare for quality response, quick response, when we get those large calls, when we have those multiple calls at one time, how do we get effective help that comes quickly? We rely so much, and we're so grateful to North County Fire Authority next door for coming out and helping us. And we do the same. We go back and forth with mutual aid, but we can't do it alone.
Yeah. Well, and that was, I actually just did an interview with Luke Planbeck with the Sheriff's Department. And it was really fascinating getting to talk with him and kind of asking him some of the questions of how do these different departments, because technically we're Island County versus, Snohomish County and Stanwood, and yet both of us are very far away from our main county headquarters of Whidbey and Snohomish. So,
yeah.
Like, I'm assuming you guys all work together pretty regularly on different either emergencies or projects?
Yeah, between the sheriff's office and us, or the other fire departments?
Well, I guess both.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I was speaking to the fire departments.
Yeah, we do. I think it's one of the things that we've done a good job of. Our training officers have done a good job of coordinating what we call multi-company operations. So, we train a lot individually as companies. We train a lot with our crews together, but we try and get together regularly with North County and Arlington, so we can make sure that we train together. When they come here or we go there to help, that we're operating with similar terminology, that we understand similar tactics and do those things. It's an important part of that seamless response. So the training officers have done a great job of making sure that we get that regular training together. In fact, we just hosted a pump operations class out here, and we had people from, I think, North County, Arlington, Tulalip Bay. A number of fire departments came out here to do some training.
Oh, very cool. Yeah, and I think that, when there's a fire or emergency going on, that's the last time you want miscommunication on aspects. So.
Absolutely. It is so critical. It's something, the common terminology piece is something we work really, really hard at. And also, it always just helps to know people. When people come up on scene and you know them, you know their capabilities, you know that you can trust them to go do whatever job they're going to do. It just makes everything run a lot smoother.
Right. Yeah. No, for sure. So, yeah, actually, that's a good question, though. How does the fire department and sheriff department, how do they integrate and all of that?
Yeah, obviously we have a lot of overlap in the types of calls that we go to. We've had a really great relationship with the sheriff's office for many, many years back to, when I was here before. I think that part of the response has really been great. I think we help each other out quite a bit. Since I've been back here, I've been meeting pretty regularly with the sheriff, with Rick Felici. He's been great. Some things that we can work on doing better together, other areas that we could maybe provide some additional services together. It's a wonderful partnership.
Yeah, and when you guys end up, like when you get a 911 call, is it automatic that you both are supposed to arrive there, or is there like certain things where it's like, no, we just need these people?
Yeah, no, we're dispatched. We definitely have the calls that we go on our own, and they go on the calls on their own, and then we have those calls that overlap together.
Got it. Okay, yeah. And that all happens on the back end of.
Yeah, I guess the dispatchers, ICOM is the organization that does our dispatch for both the fire department and the sheriff's office. And, dispatchers are kind of the unsung heroes, right? It's like, how many television shows are there about firefighters or police officers, but not a whole lot about dispatchers. They have a very challenging job, a very stressful job, and that's what they do, is they answer that call and they say what resources are needed to send help, and they get us coming.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and I think, if you've done sales or any sort of like phone thing, sometimes when the phone rings, it's like a little stressful because you're just like, oh, is this another problem? Is this a sales call? What is this? But like to know that every phone call you're going to get is an emergency.
Right. Yeah. I wonder if this is going to be a problem. Yeah, probably if somebody's having an issue. Yeah.
Wonder if there's like some sort of thing like they're like, I just don't answer my cell phone anymore.
That is a tough job.
I'm sure.
And if you go and sit with them for a few hours and watch them do their work, it's really impressive.
Yeah. No, and there's so many different organizations, as well as I was talking to Luke a little bit, and actually some of this was off the podcast because we had stopped recording. And he's like, you should have recorded that. But we talked about a little bit about the stresses and how do you guys deal with the stresses of knowing that you're going into a stressful situation. It's not going to be an easy day at work. There's some major things that are going on.
Brandon, this is something that is really near and dear to my heart, but something that we're as an industry coming more and more to terms with is understanding the emotional impact. We know the physical impact of a long career in this industry. But the emotional impact is something that we're still, struggling, I think, to get a handle on. Firefighter suicides, law enforcement suicides are through the roof. And in fact, we're starting a new, what's called a peer support program for next year, where we send a few of our firefighters to get that training so that, one, they can keep an eye out for people that they work with. If they notice some difficulties or somebody's having some troubles at home that are odd, or they're acting inconsistent, I think, with their normal behavior, or if there's an especially tough call, maybe they can lead a little bit of a discussion after to help debrief some of that. I read an article a couple years ago, and they said that the research is really changing in terms of people think of PTSD, or they think about that one large incident that causes trauma, which is absolutely true. But what they're learning is a lot of it now, it's like concussions. It's not just the one big concussion, it's the multiple concussions day after day after day. So I think it's important that we help our firefighters and our law enforcement officers find an outlet for that, find a way to release some of that. Otherwise, it builds up to some potentially very detrimental consequences.
Right. And also, I think I'm curious, is there also training that you guys work with, like, the spouses of these people? Because that's also another thing of, for the spouse to try and not fully understand but support their spouse in that, because, you know, they may come home and just, like, you know, be dealing with a lot, and how does the spouse help in that?
It really is. You know, I think that's another area that we're not doing a good enough job of serving our firefighters and their families. I think as we get this up and going, it's something we've talked about in this program, is how do we send those resources or make those resources available at home, or even just the awareness. You know, I was up in Burlington for just 3 months when the shooting at the Cascade Mall happened. And so we brought in we call it critical incident stress management, right? We debrief after those calls. We did a number of those with the responders, and then we actually hosted a session for all the responders' families so that they could come in and be part of that debrief process and say, you know, you may be seeing these things at home with your spouse or your father, and they're normal, and here's why. It was really interesting to see it work in that instance. But again, that was around the one big call.
Right.
How do we do that more regularly?
Yeah, no, it's definitely something, you know, I think it has, like you said, the research is there. There's starting to be more studies and all of these things, whereas, you know, 10, 20 years ago, it was kind of just, well, it's part of the job and we're going to move forward. But, like, I'm glad to see a lot of that changing. And
me too. Firefighter health and safety has been a real push, certainly, again, from the physical side. There was a large initiative in the state a number of years ago called Healthy and Healthy Out, trying to make firefighters aware of, you know, some of the dangers that are there, especially around cancers and things like that. And the mental health aspect is just, it's the next wave of that exact same thing.
Yeah. No, I think that's great. And, you know, I've talked to, you know, I talked to Paige with CASA, but, you know, she was working, it's different, it's animals, but they get the same thing where they can get, not to the same level, but, like, they can get to these emotional fatigue. Yeah. Because you care for these animals, and then when things go bad, or, you know, you lose one, and it feels like you've lost your own dog, right? And,
right.
Like, people, we've had definitely employees and stuff who have dealt with that, and, you know, some you know, sometimes if it's a close enough animal to them, they're like, it's like losing a loved one. They're like, I need to call out today, and, you know, and there's just,
totally makes sense.
But to get that, you know, a lot more frequent than a normal person does in a normal day, you know, normal life.
Right.
It just compounds all of that.
Yeah. So I mean, bring awareness, give tools, as we just keep doing whatever we can do. But I'm really excited about the peer support program we're starting up.
Yeah. No, that's really neat. Okay, so then I was actually reading one of your articles, but you were talking about that, I think it was when you had moved back here, but you were saying, like, as a fire chief, you really enjoyed bringing back some of that small business aspect of that team management, and how have you continued to expand that in the fire department?
You know, it's interesting in thinking about coming back, and I knew that, like, leaving for Burlington, starting my own business, very different than leaving and then coming back somewhere. And so I've really been trying to be very mindful of what it means to come back here. A lot of existing relationships, long relationships, which are great, and it's great to reconnect with those, but also to make sure that I was also coming in with a fresh set of eyes and not making assumptions about this, that, or the other, because I know that I've changed in the last 3 years quite a bit. And because of that, I know that every single person here has changed a lot in the last 3 years. We are who we are at our core, but people are different, and people grow, and then they change. And so trying to, again, I think, come in with that fresh set of eyes and take a look. The other side of that, maybe more to your question, though, is I've also been trying to be really strategic about how that works. I think part of me is just I think part of it is just you kind of go with what you know, right deep down, you know what's right, and you run with it. But I also want to really be strategic about how do we go about assessing where we are, assessing our service, building our leadership team, right, supporting our firefighters, providing better service to the community. It's been really fun, really challenging last 6 months since I've been back. And I think about it almost, my wife would say constantly. I try to not think about it constantly, but I love the challenge. I love grappling with some of the issues and the things that are coming up.
Yeah. No, and I think, as leaders, it's our job to, lead is part of that, and really empowering others and working with others and, growing that leadership team around us, not just trying to be the sole person that handles everything flows through.
Yes. Yep. Exactly. And that's exactly right.
Yeah. And I think that's really the level of leader versus, just being manager or things like that. It's that next step.
Right. And interesting, you asked a little bit about the difference in Burlington and here. In Burlington, it was one station. And so I saw everybody every day. Whew, does that make communications a whole lot easier, right?
Yeah.
Here, while spread out, again, 45 square miles, multiple stations, our administration office, it's a lot harder to do that. It takes a lot more time to go and see everybody, or have to rely on messages being passed down via officers' meetings or emails or things like that. I really like the face-to-face interpersonal interaction.
Yeah.
Just takes more time here to get to everybody. So it's just, again, one of the differences and one of the again, one of those things that I grapple with. How do I communicate? How do I over-communicate what we're doing and where we're going and those types of ideas?
Right. And how many stations are on Kamino?
There are 4 stations on Kamino. There used to be 5, and the district sold one at Camano City last year. So we have 4 stations, and then the administration office just across the street here at Terry's Corner.
Yep. Okay. And then is Kamano connected to the Island County as far as Whidbey and them?
Yeah, because absolutely, because we're part of Island County, so we're tied there in a lot of ways. Now, we are our own taxing district, right? We are our own government with our own elected officials, but we certainly work with Island County for the assessments and the tax collections and things like that, and a lot of areas that we overlap in terms of medical program control, obviously emergency management, just a lot of functions that we provide that overlap with so much of Island County.
Got it. Okay.
But I always think what's interesting, one of the things I love about Kamino, as far as I know, I could be wrong, but we're the only form of government that's truly just serving Camano Island. Mm-hmm. Right? It's Island County government, it's Stanwood Camano School District, it's Snow Owl Library. We are the only form of government that's here just for Camano Islanders, and I really like that part of it.
Yeah, no, that's very cool. And does the fire department, it operates as a government office, but does it, in some ways, does it function more like a small business in the sense of how it's managed and run?
Yes and no.
Okay.
I think government really is its own entity, and we have a very different purpose. I read a book a number of years ago by Peter Drucker, who was a management theorist, right?
Yeah.
Peter, and I'm sure you studied him, right, in school. And it was about mission, vision, values, which I very strongly believe in, but talking about it from a nonprofit perspective versus a for-profit perspective. Mm-hmm. And I kind of had that same idea around government, right? We exist. What Drucker said was, for-profit companies exist to make a business, nonprofit companies exist to make a difference. Whether you believe that or not, certainly not every company, but I kind of like that thought. We are here to make a difference in people's lives and in their quality of life.
Right.
So that part is different. At the same time, yeah, absolutely. I just think so many of the principles are the same. I think we can learn a lot from private business. I think, it's one of the things that I try and bring is my private business background in terms of how do we operate, how do we manage, how do we lead, how do we do those things. So it's been a really fun balance of there's that business side of it and there's the government side of it.
Yeah, no, that's neat, and it's good that it's. I think it's very helpful to have. Again, it's that sharing of perspectives and culture, whether that's culture perspectives inside of a company or business, or if that's across borders. Or I do think both sides are definitely. It's always helpful to have more of a broader perspective on who you're working with, and just it's just helpful for people.
Yeah, without a doubt. I love the old adage, if you have 2 team members that agree on something, you have one too many team members. Right? I really like to foster that especially in our leadership team, the diversity of thought. It's okay that we argue. It's okay that we disagree. It's okay that we have those different perspectives that you're talking about, because it makes us stronger. It makes us better when we can do that. When we can have healthy conflict, right, is when we're healthiest.
Yeah, no, for sure. And all of those bring great perspectives and different, ideas and things that you never would have thought of and challenged on. Being challenged on certain ideas that, you may think this is a great idea and you're going to run down the road with it. And then someone asks you like one pointed question on like one break point. And then you stop for a second. You're like, wait, no, you're right.
You're right.
That won't work.
That was a terrible idea.
But
We've had some of those.
Yeah, I have too. A lot of times it's my wife who's like, no, that's not a good idea. So
yeah, well, right, and surround yourself with your wife and somebody that's not afraid to tell it like it is too, right? Yeah.
No, and it's been, I've mentioned in the podcast before, but my brother-in-law and sister own the coffee roaster company, and then my wife and I own the marketplace now. But my brother-in-law and I talk all the time on different well, what if we did this?
Yeah.
And then we'll kind of go back and forth, and then sometimes it's like, no, you're right. That's a terrible idea. Why was I thinking that? But then sometimes you mention something and they're, he's like, well, yeah, but you could take this spin. Instead of shooting it down, it's like building upon.
Right.
And again, it's just adding that new perspective, and then you can really turn it into something.
It's one of my favorite things to do. In fact, people tease me here. They would tease me in Burlington all the time that I would love to, sometimes I'd come in the morning because I'm a morning person. I'd come in early and I'd say, okay, everybody in the conference room, and I love writing at the whiteboard, and we would just brainstorm ideas, and sometimes nothing came out of it, and sometimes really great things came out of it. But just that interplay with people gets us places that we couldn't alone.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think he's an author and he has a podcast, but do you know who Tim Ferriss is?
Oh yeah. Uh-huh.
One of his things he mentions in the beginning of his podcast, and it's the foundation for his 4-Hour Work Week, which is one of his biggest books. But was just asking the question, what if I did the opposite of what everyone else does? What if I did the opposite? And sometimes it's no, there's a reason everyone does it this way.
Right.
But sometimes there's not. And sometimes it's just the way it's always done.
And, we're in a mode right now with me coming in where we're trying to assess how we're doing, right? And we're trying to ask those questions. What if we did the opposite? Or what if we did this? And working with our officers and working with our leadership team, looking at trying to make some changes. And one of the officers asked, well, is it okay if we look at these things and we decide it's not a good idea? It's that's probably the best of all cases, right?
Yeah.
That we take that critical look, that we say, can we be doing things better? And if we come back to, nope, we're doing the right thing right now, that's perfect.
Yeah.
But yet we take that look. That's important.
Yeah, no, for sure. This is circling back a little bit, but what has been your most successful way to make sure that communication is going around all 4 stations and getting passed down to everyone?
I was recommended a book that I'm just starting to read by Lencioni called The Advantage. It's about organizational health. And in it, he talks about the roles of a leader. Your number 1 job is to form a strong leadership team. Your number 2 job is to develop organizational clarity. Your number 3 job is to over-communicate that clarity. And I love that. And I think that's what I'm trying to do is over-communicate.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a combination of trying to send out emails, but emails are really impersonal, and I just think that we're already inundated with so many emails as it is. I have 2 great assistant chiefs, so we are working to make sure that we're on the same page, so that we send a consistent message. We have a leadership team and officer corps working with them to make sure they're sending a consistent message. And then a lot of just going around. I'm a morning person, so I like to get in the office early. I'm my most productive in the morning. And I'm also a bit of an extrovert, so I recharge by being with people. So in the afternoon, I like to just go visit the stations and talk to people. And sometimes it's just catching up on personal things and how things are going. But usually it evolves into, questions or ideas or just what kind of things are happening in the fire department. But it's challenging.
Yeah.
It's challenging.
Yeah. And do you guys have, do you all go on a rotation of nights and days, or are there specific people that mainly work days and nights?
Yeah, so our firefighters work 48-hour shifts.
Okay.
So we, if you're a firefighter, you're assigned to either A shift, B shift, or C shift, and your shift works 2 days on and 4 days off.
Okay.
2 days on, 4 days off. So, so somebody's always on, of course. But it also makes it a little bit more challenging to try and get teams together because nobody's ever working together in a regular company. you can call a meeting at 2:00 and everybody's there. We
Yeah.
can't do that, so that makes it a little bit more challenging. But yeah,
Yeah.
they work a shift schedule.
Got it. Okay. Yeah. No, I have a little bit of that in the retail side. Is that you only have a handful of your vast pool of team members that you're pulling from, to be on shift for that day.
Right.
So then team meetings and stuff like that. When you're trying to do that, you're asking someone that's probably worked an 8-hour day already, like, hey, can you stay an extra 2 hours
Right.
for a meeting?
Right. I'm constantly asking people to come back in for a meeting for this or for
Yeah.
that or training this, that. Yep.
Yep. So it's just it adds that other aspect to it for sure.
Yeah. And, maybe again, back to our earlier conversation around technology and changing, maybe that's an area needing to embrace of, goodness knows, with so much telecommuting and people work all over the world collaboratively,
Yeah.
right? I should be able to do it within 45 square miles. So I think there's some opportunities there for some improvement.
Yeah, for sure. All right. Well, I like to end every podcast with some rapid fire questions. So the first one is, do you have a lesser known or favorite location on Camano Island that you like to hang out?
It's kind of on Camano Island. So a few years ago, I started paddleboarding.
Oh, okay.
And we live down kind of near Iverson Beach.
Oh,
and so
yes.
one of my
Yeah.
favorite things to do, I haven't been very good this year because of my new job, but to paddle out, and in the middle of Port Susan Bay, there's some old pilings. And I can paddle out there in about 45 minutes an hour. There's nobody around for miles. Usually the sun is rising. It's super peaceful. I love to jump in, go for a swim, and then paddle back. And so it's a great bit of solitude in a very kind of crowded world, I guess.
Yeah. No, I do think that's something very special about Kamino is that you can find those places. We went to Arrowhead Ranch and I went down to the axe throwing area, and it was where the end of Stanwood and Kamino joint chamber meeting. We're doing a barbecue.
Yeah. I was there that night. Yeah.
Oh yeah. I saw you, and then I didn't get a chance to say. I was like, oh, that was him. But yeah, I got to go down to the axe throwing before everyone else had gone down, and it was just like it's not that much farther down, but it's far enough away you can't hear the highway.
Yeah.
It's just peaceful and quiet, and the sun was setting, and I was like, this is really neat. Like just being able to take that deep breath.
Yeah, those kind of places are, and there are a lot of them on the island.
Yeah,
that are really wonderful.
So, very cool. All right, pretend you have a friend coming from out of town who hasn't been to Camano Island before. What would their first day here look like?
So again, I grew up in Michigan, and we would have a lot of family that would come out and visit. And I think my favorite thing when they would come, it was the quintessential Northwest day, is that we could get up early. We used to have a boat. We could we'd drop crab pots, maybe run over to Coopville for a little cinnamon roll at the Need and Feed, come back. In a couple of hours, you could be up hiking on a glacier, and then you could come back in the evening, pick up your crab pots, and boil crab on the beach. And to me, that just epitomizes the best of the Northwest, the best of Kamino, right, with access to the water, our beautiful area, access to the mountains. So, that would always be my favorite thing to do with somebody when they first come here. Yeah,
no, it is like we have Kamino, which is its own very unique and neat place to hang out and explore. But we're also an hour drive away from the North Cascade, and you can go so many different levels and hikes, and it's really neat.
Yeah.
Who is an interesting or fascinating person in this community that I should interview next?
I think there's one of the things I love about Kamino, there's so many interesting people that you just don't expect to live here, and then you meet them and you're like, you did what? Bruce Brown is a very well-known coach in the sports field. Bruce has been kind enough to help the fire department with some work on our leadership team. I only had the pleasure of meeting Bruce within the last 3 or 4 months since I've come back. He is amazing. Definitely somebody I think would be interesting to talk to.
Very cool. Do you know some of the teams or sports coaching stuff he's done?
He's worked with a lot of high school teams. I know that he worked with Chip Kelly when he was in Oregon, and then when Chip went to the NFL, Bruce did some work with them. So he's worked with different types of teams all over the country.
No, that would be fascinating.
Yeah. And I hope he's okay with me telling you that. I don't know if he's kind of semi-retired now, but he has just been, I just can't say enough about him in the short time that I've gotten to know him.
Very cool. Okay, lastly, if you could have a message on a billboard on Camano Island right as you're driving up the hill, what would that say?
That's such a hard question. I thought about that. I think I would have to take a page out of Aristotle's book, and it would say, serve people, do good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Short and sweet.
Short and sweet.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Very cool. Well, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today.
Thanks, Brandon. I appreciate being here.
All right. And Islanders, I will talk to you on the next one. Well, a big thank you to Levon for joining me on the podcast today, and thank you guys for listening. If you haven't already, be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to our podcast on your favorite podcast platform. It helps us to be found by either other Islanders like yourself. And for more information on this episode or previous episodes, go to CamanoCommons.com/podcast. That's CamanoCommons.com/podcast. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.